From Washington, this is the Macrocast with Hamilton Place Strategies and Markets Policy Partners.
Morning, it's Friday, June 17th. We're back on the Macrocast. We have a full panel this morning. I'm Tony Fratto. We have Matt McDonald. Our partners in this Macrocast at Markets Policy Partners, John Fagan and Brendan Walsh. And then our semi-regular, especially during Central Bank Palooza weeks, or at least FOMC week, is Brai, Odion-Esene, formerly HPS, now wise man of the world, giving advice and counsel everywhere. Brai, it's really great to have you with us, and especially this week. We're going to get into this, sort of the macro questions on this, but as a former government communicator, and you're a former reporter, we had this wild news breaking this week where Nick Timiraos from the Wall Street Journal gets a scoop. This is after we get the elevated CPI number last week. The weekend happens. Nick gets a scoop, and I'm making air quotes here, that the Fed is seriously considering 75 basis points after signaling for some time that we were looking at 50. And
they should have given the scoop to Leisman. Let's be honest.
I'm a central bank, or as a CNBC contributor, I was, would like to see Leisman get it, but
he earned it. He earned it.
He earned it. And we like Nick, though. Nick is he's one of those excellent reporters. He's Jay Powell's biographer now. Brai, I was actually thinking when you were going to be on the show is that if they would have given you those kinds of scoops, you'd probably still be a reporter today.
Oh yeah. I mean, I think the funny thing, it's funny you mentioned this because I mean, I became a report. Well, I started reporting, covering all this stuff in 2007, and I remember in those years, you'd always hear these names get thrown out, like John Barry from the Washington Post, Neil Irwin from the Post, my old colleague Steve Beckner from Market News, and these are people who were thrown out as like.
Yeah, by the way, John Barry was the Nick Timiraos.
Exactly. That's where I'm going.
He was at the Washington Post, and I would say he was covering Treasury when I started at Treasury 20 years ago.
Yeah. So this is not a new phenomenon. There've always been certain reporters who.
On Hills-and-Rath.
Yeah, exactly. That was so if you look at the progression, it was like John Barry, Steve Beckner, and then there was John Hills-and-Rath for a long time, right? John will always seem to get these insider scoops about which way the Fed was leaning, and now it's Nick. So this is not a new phenomenon. I think even before the era of explicit forward guidance, the Fed had ways of hinting to the markets or leaking to the markets which way policy was headed, just sort of like, I don't know if you call it a trial balloon, if that's the accurate description of what they're trying to do, or just to telegraph so that there's no shock to folks' system when the actual announcement is made. But yeah, and fair play to those guys. I think the key thing is to work for an outlet that has a big enough platform for it to make a difference.
Yeah.
Right. So to your point, that's why it tends to be the Wall Street Journal. It needs to be a big enough entity that it will reach the intended audience.
Yeah. Well, part of the reason this played out the way it did, unless you're a Fed watcher, you have no idea that this is the way it works. Is that there's a blackout period around the FOMC meetings, and it usually extends from the Saturday before FOMC week until today. Yeah, I'm sorry, Thursday. So yesterday was the last day of the blackout. So it's on the front end and the back end of the FOMC meetings. And there's there are like 2 pages of communications rules surrounding, what Fed governors can do and not do. And this is part of their rules. They can't do media interviews. They can't, go on TV. They just have to be very, protect their public communications. They also have to take care to make sure that even things that they may have said before the blackout period don't pop up during the blackout period. And so on the one level, in modern times, I don't even know why blackout period makes any sense at all, so that they have to do these kinds of sort of machinations to signal to the market when they get new information. It seems like it's an arcane rule from a time when it was difficult to communicate and it was difficult for market participants to get information all at the same time. So back in the newspaper and evening news world, a blackout period made a lot of sense, so that because the delivery of news was all uneven. So if, say 30 years ago, they were going to give that piece of information to the Wall Street Journal, no one would know until it showed up on their newsstands the following morning in a newspaper story, and then word of mouth would spread around. And so you have this very uneven dissemination of information from the central bank. Now you got a period where they got really important piece of news on a Friday, and they can't do anything with it because of this so-called, the blackout rule until the Wednesday when they come out and put out the statement. That's a very long time in modern times to go with not hearing from the premier economic agency in the world. 5 days, you have to wait to hear from them on how they interpreted this new piece of news. And
Tony, that throws off all the vibes of like you're describing the mechanics of how to make fire, and there's like a lighter has been invented. I don't know. It's
something like that. It's like this is modern times, instant dissemination of news.
Well, I think
probably do away with the blackout rule altogether.
If I can make one argument, and this is just one argument in favor of keeping the blackout rule, is that, Tony, your point would make sense if you could impose some sort of discipline on all the FOMC members to not, go rogue with their opinions. I think that's part of the problem, is that as a reporter, if, for example, last week's CPI number comes out, right, I'd be on the phone trying to call, a regional Fed president that I was on good terms with to get their reaction, right? And then so they, if you get these competing voices with different takes, that kind of like muddies the waters into like what the Fed's trying to do into like clear guidance, right? So I do see the blackout serving that purpose in preventing these folks who, to some extent, they can't control from spouting off that close to a meeting. So I think that's one argument in favor of keeping the blackout.
I think you sound like a wire reporter, where like the things that the wire reporters told me was like, we all go in together, we all go out together, nobody gets hurt, Tell us all at the same time, all together, and you want some order. You guys are the enforcers of order on economic communications. I hear what you're saying, but look, I mean, I just think that these guys are all appointed in their own right, and the market over time will determine who are the right guys to listen to and who aren't. Mm-hmm. I thought it was really interesting, like Esther George's dissent, and everybody thought, oh wow, she's a dove. She only wanted 50, she didn't want 75. Like, that's weird. And it actually wasn't, right? It was a structural dissent, apparently, right? I mean, the guess is that it was a structural dissent where
it's a process point, not a substance point, right?
Exactly. She felt like apparently she felt that and has a strong view that the Fed should be doing more to roll off the balance sheet than focusing on the policy rate. And so, but just interesting, so you learn these things about each of these guys, and no one, if a SEC commissioner came out and gave a speech before a SEC hearing and said, look, this is where I'm going to go with my vote, this is where I'm leaning, no one would think twice about it. Yeah. People, market moving information, right? Just important. It's just an individual member nominated, confirmed, and holding a seat in their own rights. And they should be able to express themselves whenever they want, except I would say not on the day of the meeting, and maybe, so if they're meeting on those 2 days, don't talk on those days. But if someone came into those meetings and said, Hey, look, where I'm heading is I really think, I don't know where the rest of the board is going to be. And I'm not speaking for the rest of the board, but I'm leaning towards 75. I think that's the right way to go. I don't think they're like, it would just be another piece of information that the market interprets. And frankly, by the way, I'm not sure that it makes much difference that they had to push it out early anyway. So in a way, I'm not sure it was necessary to violate the blackout rule either. Like what John and Brendan, I mean, you guys were in the markets, and there were other people out there in the private sector saying 75 basis points. If they just came out and it was 75 basis points and that was our headlines on Wednesday afternoon and the market sells off or whatever it's going to do, fine. Right? How would it be different this week?
Yeah, I mean, it really is. Well, it's so context dependent. I mean, when you look back at the communications, I mean, the strategy is obviously, I think you guys are raising some really important points, and there is definitely a sense that the blackout period may be a little archaic, and it just non-operative really. Like when the Fed needs to get out a message during the blackout period, guess what? They do it. So and in a way that is not subtle. So
anyway, I think I said arcane, and you used the correct term. It's archaic.
Anyway, it's maybe a little bit of both. Actually.
Might be both, yeah.
To be fair, one of the reasons that they've had to do this is they've been obviously, as I said, context is important. This is an extremely challenging macro context. You don't want to sound like a Monday morning quarterback, but we remember during the press conference at the previous rate hike, there was the Chair Powell took 75 basis points off the table in a very directed way. And that's the kind of communication setup and the communication, the evolution of the communications that perhaps put them in a position where they had to make that kind of, directed leak to the press to give the markets a clue. There's also, a sense of, we've seen this communications issue in the past. Again, you don't want to second guess the Fed too much because of the difficult job that they've done. But one of the communications mainstays of the Fed over the last few years really has been that focus on core PCE prices, right? And messaging on that. Now the Fed's messaging on, and focusing on core PCE prices almost to the exclusion of every other inflation metric really discounted the kinds of market reactions you would get to a CPI number, for instance, or a PPI number. They would say, rightly so, the Fed has told us that the CPI isn't really what they're looking at, or the PPI isn't really what they're looking at. The Fed, this may not be a time for nuance, but the current communications set of the Powell Fed is that any inflation number is just as important as any other inflation number, even though they're targeting core PCE. And so they're very reactive to CPI, and therefore the markets are very reactive to CPI. And I think that that's another communication substance that, sort of put them in a position where they really, really had to react to the CPI, whereas they could have possibly structured it so that that they weren't in such a challenging communications position.
We saw the instant market reaction was a positive, right? Do you think markets were had considered that the Fed might go further than 75 once the news broke?
Oh yeah, there was definitely a lot of chatter that they would go for 1%.
Yeah.
And that wasn't the base case, but there was a sense that the Fed, had really lost that CPI number had really changed the game. And we're talking about like a CPI number that was, it's significant, but it was like a couple of tenths, right, on a month-to-month basis between utter freak out that we saw in the markets and what would have been actually, in line with expectations and not that shocking, and certainly would put us in a kind of steady as she goes 50 basis point approach. You don't want to discount a couple of tenths of a percentage point on CPI on a month-to-month basis, But that's really what we're talking about here. These figures are pretty volatile.
Do you think that was more? It's so funny, and then look at Matt's thoughts on this also. Like it's sort of interpreting these kinds of things, interpreting data like that is, like, so you're right. I mean, literally, I think expectations were 8.4 and it was 8.6. Is that right? I mean, that's all we're talking about. But I got the sense that there were people out there who were hope wishing for a better, a surprise, right? An upside surprise, right? Something like if something had like a chance that something came in with a 7 handle, and then you do take, maybe you do take 75 off the table for sure, and then it's not quite off to the races, but people are a little bit more settled about the direction. The peak inflation story, has some texture to it that it didn't have before.
Yeah, I don't know, as I look at the data and the environment, all I can think of is the weird parallels between the supply chain problems and the Fed problems, is that you have this kind of systemic, I mean, if you ever like study operations theory and like bullwhip effects and delays, and I mean, that's what supply chains are going through now. And it feels like that's the same thing that the Fed is going through, is that there's a delayed impact to the policies. You have a different dynamic with monetary policy than with supply chains, in that you have the expectations game that you're playing alongside that, which makes it particularly difficult. So you're both trying to manage the reality of the economy and how interest rates flow through the economy, and manage people's expectations, which obviously like impact the economy as well. But it just has this quality of kind of, there's one dimension where you have to be patient and it has to heal itself. And there's another dimension of every month that passes without seeming impact of the policies is that it ratchets up the demand to change course or to ratchet it up, because we're just not wired for the kind of delayed impact of the policy, which I think goes back to kind of the process question of the 50 versus 75 and the timeline of like, it's not like, I don't know. I mean, all of this stuff has a massive lag effect. So like whenever the 75 moves through the economy, does that matter as compared to if they've done a 50? I don't know. I mean, I'm incrementally skeptical on that, but I think what they're managing to a lot is the expectations, which is why it's like, okay. I mean, if to extend the question is like, okay, so the inflation metric came out just before the meeting. If that had happened 2 weeks ago and people had time to digest, and that the Fed had time to digest, is it also a 75 or a 50? I don't know, but I think it's just kind of a slightly different conversation than kind of like everybody amped up over the inflation number, even if it's, to your point, Tony, even if it's like a couple notches above. For the record, though, I will say that like since we've discussed, I was incrementally on the side of soft landing, say 2 months ago, and I'm incrementally on the side of my base case at this point is that they do not avoid a recession. That's my base case. I think it's going to be I don't think it's going to be bad. I don't think it's going to be harsh, because like there's a lot of aspects of the economy that are still robust. And to be clear, you've got a lot of uncertainty, and the uncertainty can break to the upside as well as the downside, which is interesting. But my base case now is that that it's bumpier than has been anticipated.
Well, and to that point, and I'm going to put my reporter hat on for 2 seconds, and I have a question for the group based on what Matt just said, and it's about the lag in the transmission effect of monetary policy from when it's implemented to when it actually felt in the economy. Because you see right now, there's already news of layoffs in certain industries, like the mortgage industry is an example of that. You've seen like the Business Roundtable's CEO survey, where there's looking ahead 6 months, they're planning to cut capital spending. You're seeing like the NFIB, National Federation of Independent Business Survey, where small businesses are planning to raise prices. So I feel like already we're seeing happen to slowing down demand, slowing down economic activity. Have you ever see those comedies where like you have a car speeding towards a cliff, you're trying to brake, you succeed in braking right as you like the front of the car goes over the cliff and you're teetering without falling, and then a bird lands on the hood and takes the car over the cliff. There's any concern here that based on, like, to Matt's point, expectations, folks are like ratcheting things down, and then the interest rates hike hit that takes us off that cliff? Like, what do we think about that?
I mean, like, it is an interesting dynamic of, like, if you look at CEO sentiment right now, it's like going through the floor, right? And then you've got like tech world, which is not the full economy, but is like a portion, and certainly a portion of growth. It's a very interesting dynamic out there, you know?
Yeah.
It was a little strange. I think people didn't focus on it that much because he obviously has a lot to say in press conferences. But Fed Chair Powell stated, obviously he was pushing back on, the charges that the Fed was intent on forcing the economy into a recession in order to control inflation. He said that's obviously not the case. And even if it were, he would obviously not tell you that that's the case. But anyway, he followed that by saying he is not seeing no sign of a broader slowdown that I can see in the economy, was the quote, which is a little bit surprising and not necessarily in line with the data. Brai, you laid out a lot of the different things that we are seeing, and the CEOs. Matt, you're totally right. The Wall Street Journal has like 60% of US CEOs seeing a recession coming in the next 12 to 18 months. 15% think we're already in one right now. The City Surprise Index, which is put together by Citi and gauges the quantum of upside and downside surprise in US economic data, is as negative as it's been in 5 years. We're not seeing contraction in PMIs yet. We saw the Philly Fed start to contract. PMIs are tend to follow that metric. And we saw a pretty lousy retail sales number in the latest reading. I don't know. It's there. Obviously, he's trying to bulk up the sort of hawkish, the hawkish momentum here at the Fed, but it doesn't really seem to wash with what most of the rest of us are seeing in the economy. And
I'll be the contrarian on this, because I actually think we will avoid a recession, but I'm going to make I think we're going to avoid a recession on revisions, right? I think we may have like some early prints that show a negative quarter or two, and then 2 months later, another quarter later, and be like, oh no, we revised up. I was positive, but it felt like a recession.
That's a precise call.
Yeah.
But that said,
that says that you're like 50% plus one that we avoid.
That's right.
That is as close as you can possibly get. That is getting off the wait list for.
I'm going to say positive growth between 1% and 2% over the next 18 to 24 months. And the reason is, though, they're, of course, they're not trying to engineer a recession. They are trying to engineer a slowdown. The reasons I think this time really, really is different is that there's not a lot of fat out there, no one has ever uttered the word recession while the U.S. economy was looking at 3.6% unemployment rate. It's never happened before in history where someone says, oh, I'm really worried about a recession. They think like you're out of your minds to even be talking about a recession with 3.6% unemployment. And then so you look at like some of the areas that are going to slow down, and the areas that are going to slow down are places that need to slow down, but also cannot slow down catastrophically. And that's housing. Again, just go back. Like I said this on the show last week, we're not going to see that. It's not going to be the situation where we see tracts of housing in Las Vegas with nobody living in the neighborhood, or empty condos in Fort Lauderdale. Like that doesn't exist. We have a housing shortage. We could see a severe drop in new housing. I think we've seen like new housing starts have come off pretty rapidly, but they weren't running very hot. Like they weren't building a lot of houses. There aren't a lot of workers to go out to build the houses that we would like to build. So we don't have a housing overhang. We still have a housing shortage, and we'll still have a housing shortage even if we have a recession. So like, I just don't see like the components of it. And I do think what we're seeing that is driving, that is hard to see in the data, but except for like some signs of it, is just this rotation into services. Like we're clearly seeing a rotation into services, people doing things instead of buying things. And the hottest markets, housing and autos, are coming off their highs, and that's kind of what you want anyway.
It's a good case. You've persuaded me that when the recession comes, I will wait until the recount to see if I'm not going to be like, we'll wait until the recount is done. I would look like the flip side of this, to extend the supply chain metaphor for this, is just I worry about like the bullwhip effect on this, is that it has this quality of kind of like, as we, the CEOs, or as interest rates go up, is like everybody kind of like hitting the brakes at the same time. It just feels like the precision required, and you're right, there's buffer there and underlying strength, but I just worry about the precision required to like bring it to a full stop at that like correct point. You know what I mean?
Great. And actually, to your point, some of the factors on like again, I know John has said it, Matt has said it, but just underscoring the difficulty of the job that the Fed has to do is you have a dynamic environment, you have it impacted by sentiment, you have you're trying to manage expectations, you have the lag effect of the actual things that you do, and the actual things that you do are also variable in that you have two different tools on the balance sheet and on the rate. And then you have the timing, the magnitude, right? And
external events that you don't control.
And the external events. So like, this is really hard. And so we shouldn't, we said it, but it's really hard for them to get it precisely right.
Well, I mean, come on, Tony, it's like sports talk radio. We're not here to sympathize with how hard their jobs are. We're here to like have opinions.
Good point. Hey, can we don't have a lot of time left, and 4 other central banks met this week. We'd like to talk about what they all did.
Yeah, this week really had it was Central Bank of Palooza, and this is after the European Central Bank last week, and the Reserve Bank of Australia last week. This week we had Bank of England, we had Swiss National Bank, which was not expected to be particularly noteworthy, and the Bank of Japan last night. And these are all kind of across the spectrum. It was the Bank of England had they were right kind of down the fairway with a 25 basis point rate hike, but signaling that things could go faster, while at the same time publishing some pretty downbeat economic numbers, which frames for everybody the grim reality that global central banks are hiking into a slowdown / supply shock, and maybe hiking quite aggressively into that kind of economic dynamic. The Swiss National Bank, the staid and boring, and they hadn't raised rates since like 2007 or something. I mean, it was ridiculous. And they came out and blasted the markets off balance with a 50 basis point rate hike out of the clouds, and then said that they were going to sell down equities potentially. This is a central bank that is obsessed with the strength of the currency and spends pretty much all of their monetary policy ammunition at trying to keep the Swiss franc from going too strong. But this was an enormous change, and it really the market was in a fragile state. We'd had a little bit of a relief rally after the Fed, and the Swiss National Bank contributed to this, rekindling of stagflation fears and a sense that things are out of control. The Bank of Japan, however, is really the outlier, and it has. Governor Kuroda is in the last year of his decade-long campaign to reflate the Japanese economy. We talked about this last week, and he is absolutely determined. And he came in last night against all kinds of market pressure with the 10-year Japanese government bond yield banging on the ceiling of its 25 basis point upper range. They target 0 in their yield curve control with a 25 basis point corridor on each side. And he came back and knocked it back into that range. And the yen took a beating, but it didn't fall past its multi-decade low that it registered over the last week. And, the Bank of Japan appears to still be, in control. They tweaked markets to knock speculators off balance and basically said, don't test us. And this is a very, very different situation. They have a leg to stand on from an economic perspective. They have, energy and food price inflation, but the underlying forces of price pressures are very tame still in Japan, and they're already contracting economically. So
you kind of have to say, they're really the only central bank that's meeting its target. It's hitting its targets, right? Central bank that's hitting its targets. I can't think of one.
Right. Yeah. And so the idea that Kuroda would snatch defeat from the jaws of victory and give up just as he's about to get the Japanese economy to that reflationary promised land that he's been searching for so long, I think is
for decades. This has been like decades of how to get positive inflation in Japan. This is like the story, the global macroeconomic story when you talk about Japan for decades has been about deflation. Now they get a little bit of traction, and we're telling them to stop whipping that horse, stop, get off the stick, stop whipping it. And it's like, stop. I just got this thing running.
Yeah. The other central banks, obviously, just to run through it, and the People's Bank of China is still in easing mode. Well, they are in easing mode. It's gradual and sort of glacial as it is. So they're very out of step with global central banks. And we saw the European Central Bank after flagging that they're going to be hiking rates at the July meeting. That's their liftoff for the July meeting. They flagged that, but they were forced this week to come back and have a policy tweak, the anti-fragmentation policy, because of the ways in which they're basically stepping away from the bond market, wrapping up some QE programs, declining QE programs, the asset purchases. And embarking on a rate hike, surprise, surprise, started to pressure peripheral bonds. And so Italian bonds started to, that sort of, that flashback to the European debt crisis dynamics that we've seen, where the spread of Italian 10-year yields over German Bund yields begins to blow out. And the European Central Bank, President Lagarde had said, earlier in her tenure, we're not in the business of trying to tighten the spread. Well, she's now in the business of tightening that spread quite explicitly. So it's just Italy for global central banks.
John, is it just Italy? As I say, I'm getting on an airplane to Italy this afternoon, so hopefully things will hold together while I'm there for the next week. But is it just Italy, or other
peripherals? Yeah. When you're talking about I guess the unfortunate acronym was the PIGS, right? Yeah. Portugal, Italy, Greece, Spain.
Yeah.
They're all in different degrees. Italy is the most that is taken over for Greece as the biggest focus. It's obviously the hugest bond market, and pressure there is considered, it's considered systemic and existential to the European project. In a way that even Greece isn't, obviously. So it's a big focus, and we don't have all the details on this anti-fragmentation, but it certainly seems like they're directing their asset purchases, the remaining asset purchase programs, specifically to the periphery, and expressly trying to hold in the spread. The spread has tightened. Italian bond yields, the 10-year yield has come down pretty swiftly over since they announced it, which is encouraging. 418 to 359. The last time I looked, that's the direction you want, and the euro is stabilized. So it's weird. The European Central Bank kind of has their foot on the gas and into brake at the same time. So a little bit of easing to help the tightening go down, I guess, or directed easing or recharacterization of the easing. It's a fascinating situation, but it speaks to just how challenging a situation they're in.
Yeah. I'll be doing whatever I can, for the next week to try to, contribute to their GDP. So a little help with balance of payments there while I'm there.
A lot of leisure and hospitality spending, Tony.
At least hospitality. I don't know how much leisure, but a good bit of hospitality. So what about next week? What are we looking forward to next week?
We have the global PMIs, both services and manufacturing. So that'll be an important data point to see how the global economy is doing after all this central bank tightening. And then the RBA, the Royal Bank of Australia, sorry. And also the Central Bank of Turkey has a meeting. The Turkish economy has been on quite a roller coaster ride the last couple of years. So they always have an interesting choice to make.
Yeah, I always look forward to Turkey because it's it's like a monetary policy counterculture there. And
it is. It's inverted. But and as if we didn't have enough, we can have a lot more discussion about Fed communications. Chair Powell is on the Hill next week.
Yes, Humphrey Hawkins next week. So that'll be really interesting. I mean, we could just have Nick on the show, early, and he'll tell us, right?
Kind of give a little preview of what to expect.
Yeah. All right, guys. Thanks for great. Is it Fed Palooza, Central Bank Palooza? What are we going with?
Probably Central Bank Palooza.
Central Bank Palooza.
Let's workshop it.
This week. Yeah. Matt McDonald, Brai, John, Brendan. Have a great weekend. We'll see you. Well, you'll see these guys, some subset of these guys next week on the Macrocast. I'll still be in Italy, but I'll catch you in 2 weeks. Have a great weekend.
Thanks, guys.
Thank you for listening to the Macrocast. Please remember to subscribe, rate, and share.